One moment, this man was conducting a farewell ceremony for a woman's late husband, and the very next, he became involved with the widow. In his words, this was God's way of comforting the widow for her loss. He is Hemund, the warrior bishop of the Sherborne diocese in Wessex. It seems England has finally introduced a character with flair. The story picks up right where the last episode left off. Ivar, having lost his sanity, murders his own brother over a petty argument, an act that is unforgivable to many. Filled with guilt, Ivar admits to his grave mistake and swears it wasn't intentional. He was blinded by rage. After apologizing to everyone, Ivar leaves the room. Truth be told, Sigurd has always ridiculed and mocked Ivar for his disability, a fact known to all, and they couldn't justify killing Ivar just for Sigurd's sake. However, Ub insists that the temperamental Ivar cannot lead, but Bjorn has lost interest in meddling. Once ready, Bjorn and Halfdan embark on their Mediterranean journey, after successively losing his daughter, Ragnar, and Helga. Floki's heart was completely shattered. Now that Ragnar's death has been avenged, he sees no reason to stay and decides to set out on a purposeless voyage alone. Now, only the three brothers remain as leaders in England. Ub suggests dividing East Anglia to settle and farm the land. Ivar still wants to take advantage of the situation and continue the attack. He wants to establish a permanent stopover on the coast, so that it will be easy to go to England or back to Norway. This would allow them to secure their foothold once again. He sets his sights on York in the northeast, drawn by its rivers and proximity to the coast. This time Hvitserk agreed with Ivar's decision. After all, they were in a position where they could easily be attacked from the back. A few days later, they arrive outside York. Ub recalls his father mentioning that during the Feast of Saints, people are either in church praying or deeply inebriated, making it the most opportune time for an attack. Then, learning from the children that the Ascension of Christ is in 3 days, Ivar decides that's when they'll strike York. Meanwhile, Hemund arrives in a pillaged Wessex, where they rebuild the ruined town and hold a funeral for King Ecbert. Hemund also learns of Ecbert's succession and his schemes from witnesses and decides to seek out the new king, Ethelwulf.
Then Ethelwulf is king, and the grant of land worthless. Yes.
Before leaving, Hemund takes an interest in a woman attending mass. Afterwards, feeling ashamed, Hemund strips naked and walks through thorns, allowing them to pierce every inch of his skin as penance for his actions.
Please forgive me, three-person God. Punish me! Ravish me!
Currently, Ethelwulf is taking refuge in the marshes, clearly living in harsh conditions. Alfred shows his frail constitution. Ever since fleeing from Hvitserk, he's been bedridden, his face covered in dark spots. The nature of his illness unknown, but since he's the future father of England, these ailments will surely pass. This marks the Vikings' first brutal assault on an English town, a massacre that would be remembered for its sheer brutality. Their goal was to capture York, a major town in Northumbria, to establish a forward base in England from which they could advance or retreat at will. On the day of the siege, Ub was in charge of taking the city walls. Just as Ub had predicted, on the Feast of the Saints, most people were off praying and celebrating, leaving only a few sentinels on the walls. Facing almost no resistance, Ub easily took control of the city gates. The excitement of these Vikings was like a group of sharks that had smelled blood after a long hunger. When the Vikings reached the church, the devout worshippers inside were completely unaware of the chaos unfolding outside. Not even God told them they were about to be slaughtered like lambs. Ub did not kill these unarmed civilians. In this aspect, he was much like Ragnar, but the others couldn't care less. In minutes, the Christians' heaven turned into hell. A nun, to avoid being defiled by these demons, took her own life by cutting her wrists. Ivar showed his brutal side by grabbing the bishop and melting his crucifix before brutally pouring gold into the archbishop's mouth. What Ivar did was indeed brutal, but it also showed his hatred of Christianity. His father was too much of a believer in Christians, which led him to that fate. But that's not all. Ivar had the bishop chained to a horse and paraded around as a warning to the people not to go against him. Ub was the first to disagree with Ivar, thinking him too extreme. He also reminded Ivar not to forget Sigurd's death. Meanwhile, Harald, full of anticipation, returned to Kattegat, unaware that Egil's mission had failed. Only when Harald saw Lagertha still firmly seated on the throne did he realize his mistake, but it was too late. He had no choice but to report on the situation in England while feigning calm. It wasn't until Harald finished his report that Lagertha exposed his true nature.
And I thought that perhaps you wanted to find out how well Egil the Bastard had served you. Perhaps you expected to find him here, sat upon the throne, keeping it warm for you.
Harald didn't deny Lagertha's accusations, so it was only natural that he should pay for his behavior. After a severe beating, Harald told Lagertha what was in his heart. He had aspired to be king of Norway to impress a woman, not out of spite for Lagertha. Now that the woman was dead, he would no longer attack Kattegat. Harald proposed an alliance, suggesting that since he lacked a woman and Lagertha a man, a marriage between them could solidify her position.
Do you really think, King Harald, that I would prostrate myself at your feet and offer thanks to the gods that you would deign to be my husband? Grateful for you that you would offer to come to my bed in all your glory.
Harald was right about Lagertha not having a man for too long, but as a queen she couldn't let her enemies find her weakness so easily. But this was the perfect opportunity for her to let off some steam. The next morning, several women argued over Harald's proposal. Astrid didn't trust the ambitious man, but Lagertha thought it worth considering. As Lagertha's lover, Astrid naturally opposed the marriage, storming out of the room in anger. But Astrid was right. How could Harald give up his claim to the throne? Just as Lagertha let her guard down, Harald had already escaped, and he had kidnapped Astrid. Why did Harald kidnap Astrid? And how would Lagertha respond upon finding out?
They've gone. Who's gone? King Harald and his men. Their boats have gone. They freed him and killed some of the guards.
Where's Astrid?
Astrid.
Ivar plans to sacrifice this beautiful woman before the big battle, but instead of fearing her fate, she tells him she's willing to do anything for him.
Then take off your clothes.
Alfred finally gets out of bed, but the first thing he does is sleepwalk. That day, he was drawn to a dark figure, and when he saw his true colors, Alfred fainted. After being rescued and brought ashore, a foul liquid bursts from his mouth. But once it's all out, he's much clearer-headed. Alfred tells Ethelwulf they must go to York because the people there are in dire straits.
But how? How do you know?
My father told me.
He says the shadowy figure was his biological father, Athelstan. So, they set out for York, guided by the saint. Soon, they arrive outside the city of York. Coincidentally, just as Hemund, who had arrived earlier, is also there. The bishop finally meets his new king. After a brief exchange, Hemund begins to report to Ethelwulf. York is a building left over from the Roman Empire. Several of the stones in the walls have started to loosen over the years, something the Vikings hadn't noticed, so there was a chance to break through. However, Hemund advocates for patience, suggesting they wait for more troops and conduct further reconnaissance before making a decision. Hemund's forcefulness is a bit overbearing, and he seems to have no regard for the new king, as he's the one who's giving the orders. Meanwhile, Harald has returned to his kingdom, along with Astrid, whom he had kidnapped. Harald wants Astrid to be his queen, promising her the title of Queen of all Norway once he conquers it. Astrid doesn't respond to Harald's proposal.
You know I want to make this town the capital of Norway. It has always been my dream. This woman is Astrid. She is part of my dream.
It is clear that Astrid does not like this place or Harald, but seeing how the crowds are flocking to their king, she is beginning to see Harald in a different light. After many days of wandering, Floki's supplies were running low and his raven was down to its last one. Then Floki was unlucky enough to be caught in a storm. The sight of a lone boat on the vast ocean perfectly captures the Viking's spirit of exploration. After an unknown span of time, Floki's ship finally made landfall on a beach. Floki the Crow was the first person in history to discover and name Iceland. He was called the Raven Man because Viking explorers were skilled at using ravens to find land. When Floki set sail, he brought along 3 ravens. The release of these ravens if they did not return indicated the presence of land in that direction. Thus, the land Floki landed on is very likely to be Iceland. Unlike other lands, the beaches here are black and the ground is covered with moss-covered volcanic rock. After Floki crossed the mountains and saw volcanoes, waterfalls, hot springs and rivers, he saw many unexplained miracles. For example, his hands suddenly recovered from paddling, and he saw humanoid deities, all of which made him think that the land beneath him was the land of the gods. Floki plans to return to Kattegat to bring people to settle here. Back in York, Ivar receives news of the English forces gathering. Before the battle, he plans a sacrifice. His men bring a beautiful slave, but Freydis is unafraid of Ivar, even knowing she's to be sacrificed. She expresses her willingness to do anything for him.
Then take off your clothes.
Freydis' willingness to sacrifice herself left Ivar at a loss, but her words that followed boosted his confidence even more.
I know you're a cripple, boneless, but let me tell you something. Your deformity means that the gods favor you, especially. I've always known that. I always look for people who are born different. You are destined for great things.
Her words not only save her life but also grant her freedom. She is the second woman to be so sure of Ivar, so could she be the woman of his destiny? Can Ethelwolf, with Hemun's help, successfully take York? See you in the next episode.
Tomorrow we attack York.
And may God be with us.